Hello students and welcome to today's class on the short story The Kitemaker by Ruskin. This is part 1 of the lesson. The lesson is taken from Unit 7, Semester 4 and it is being presented by Dr. P.V. Geeta Lakshmi Patnaik, Associate Professor of English, PGR Government Degree College, Narayanguda, Hyderabad. Before we move on to the story, let me ask you a quick question. What do you think this story is going to be about? As you can see, the title of the story is The Kite Maker. So do you think that the story is going to be about the kite maker's life? Or is it going to be about the kites that he makes? Is it about a specific kite? What is it going to be about? Let us see. But before that, let us take a brief look at the biography of Ruskin. Ruskin is a renowned Indian author, and his books for children and young adults are very popular. He was born to Anglo-Indian parents on the 19th of May 1934 in Kasauli, Himachal Pradesh. He grew up in Jamnagar, Dehradun, New Delhi and Shimla. While studying in Bishop Cotton School in Shimla, he was known as a great debater, athlete and writer. His first novel, The Room on the Roof, was published when he was only 17 years old. In all, he has published more than 100 books, and among them are novels, collections of stories, essays, etc. He has received 2 awards from the Sahitya Academy. The first is the Annual Academy Award in 1992 for his anthology of stories, Our Trees Still Grow in Dehra. And the second is the Bal Sahitya Puraskar in 2012 for total contribution to children's literature. He was honored with the Padma Shri in 1999 and the Padma Bhushan in 2014. Ruskin stories have also been adapted into films. Some of the famous films based on his works are Junoon, which is based on A Flight of Pigeons and is directed by Shyam Benegal. Saat Khoon Maaf, based on Susanna's 7 Husbands, and The Blue Umbrella, based on a book with the same title, were both directed by Vishal Bharadwaj. And we now move on to the glossary, or the list of words, difficult words in the lesson with their meanings. The first word is cobble, which means rounded stone used on the surface of an old-fashioned road. Disdain is to consider or reject something as undeserving of respect. Swerve is to turn or change direction suddenly. Swoop is to move down suddenly and quickly through the air. Tangle, to get twisted together or to get into a knot. Retinue is a group of people accompanying an important person. Trample is to walk heavily on something, damaging or hurting it. Sprig is a small piece of a plant with leaves. Undulate is to have a wave-like appearance or to have a continuous up and down shape like waves in the sea. Cumbersome is large and difficult to use or move. Device is a piece of equipment. Wriggle is to twist or turn the body with short, quick movements. Glint is to shine from reflection. Vivid is brightly colored or lively. Spacious is large and with a lot of space. Descendant is a successor or a person who is related to someone who lived a long time ago. Affinity is similarity. Resplendent is brilliant, dazzling. Steed is an animal used for riding, a horse. Gust is a sudden strong blast of wind. So these students are the difficult words in the lesson, and now it's time for us to move on to the actual lesson. But before that, let us take a very quick look at what the story is all about. This is just to put it in a context so that you can be able to understand quickly. The Kite Maker is a moving story about an expert kite maker, Mahmood, and the world he belonged to. Watching his grandson Ali fly kites, Mahmood recollects a time when he was well known throughout the city for his special kites. Through Mahmood's reverie, Bond creates a bygone era when people had the time for leisurely pastimes such as kite flying and the aesthetic sense to patronize crafts such as kite making. In the hustle and bustle of modern, materialistic city life, no one cares about either Mahmood or his mastery. Bond uses several symbols, trees, birds, stringed and severed kites, with telling effect to depict the nature of human life. And now, let us read the story, students. The Kite Maker by Ruskin Bond. There was but one tree in the street known as Gully Ramnath, an ancient banyan that had grown through the cracks of an abandoned mosque, and little Ali's kite had caught in its branches. The boy, barefoot and clad only in a torn shirt, ran along the cobblestones of the narrow street to where his grandfather sat nodding dreamily in the sunshine of their back courtyard. "Grandfather," shouted the boy, "my kite has gone." The old man woke from his daydream with a start, and raising his head, displayed a beard that would have been white had it not been dyed red with mehendi leaves. "Did the twine break?" he asked. "I know that kite twine is not what it used to be." "No, grandfather, the kite is stuck in the banyan tree." The old man chuckled. "You have yet to learn how to fly a kite properly, my child, and I'm too old to teach you. That's the pity of it. But you shall have another." He had just finished making a new kite from bamboo paper and thin silk, and it lay in the sun firming up. It was a pale pink kite with a small green tail. The old man handed it to Ali, and the boy raised himself on his toes and kissed his grandfather's hollowed out cheek. "I will not lose this one," he said. "This kite will fly like a bird." And he turned on his heels and skipped out of the courtyard. So, students, let us go back to the first paragraph of the story. There was but one tree in the street known as Gully Ramnath. Just one tree. So the story begins with this tree. And what kind of a tree was it? It was an ancient banyan tree that had grown through the cracks of an abandoned mosque. So there is an abandoned mosque in the street, and this banyan tree had grown through the cracks of the abandoned mosque. And so, and little Ali's kite had caught in its branches. So this is the introduction to the banyan tree and to this little boy called Ali. So the story begins with the tree, which is a symbol throughout the story. So you have to pay attention to this, students. The boy, barefoot and clad only in a torn shirt, ran along the cobblestones of the narrow street to where his grandfather sat, nodding dreamily in the sunshine of their back courtyard. So the first paragraph is very important because it is here that we are introduced to the grandfather. We still don't know his name, of course, and the grandson, little Ali. And we also have a kite which is actually stuck or caught in the branches of the banyan tree. So the most important aspects in the story, that is the banyan tree, the kite, Ali, and the grandfather are all introduced in this first paragraph. "Grandfather," shouted the boy, "my kite is gone." So this is the drama which is already introduced. So the boy is running up to his grandfather and he shouts, "Grandfather, my kite has gone." So the old man, who was actually nodding dreamily in the sunshine of the back courtyard, was actually having a daydream, and he wakes up with a start. And raising his head, he displays a beard, and this beard, which would have been white, is actually dyed red with mehendi leaves. So the description of the old man is very vivid, and the reader has a very strong impression of an old man with a red beard, a beard which has been dyed with mehendi leaves. And there is this little boy, Ali, and look at the description, students. The boy is little, that shows that he is a very young boy, and he's barefoot. He doesn't have any kind of footwear, and he's clad only in a torn shirt. So these two expressions tell us that the boy is not rich. And the old man, who is actually nodding dreamily, the grandfather, obviously is also not rich. So in these few lines, we can already have an idea about the kind of background to which the grandfather and the grandson belong. Let us go to the next part. Did the twine break? He asked. I know that kite twine is not what it used to be. So the moment the boy tells him that the kite is stuck in the banyan tree, the old man asks him, did the twine break? Because he says he knows that kite twine is no longer what it used to be. The inference is that students in the olden days or in in early days, in a period that has already gone by, kite twine used to be very strong, but now, according to the grandfather, the twine is not as strong. The boy is quick to tell him that, no, that it's not the twine that is broken, but it is the kite which is stuck in the banyan tree. So he says, no, grandfather, the kite is stuck in the banyan tree. The old man chuckled. He finds this funny, and he says, you have yet to learn how to fly a kite properly, my child, and I'm too old to teach you. That's the pity of it. But you shall have another. So he tells him that the child is still not able to learn how to fly a kite properly. And he says that he's very old, but still it's okay because he's going to give him another one. And the old man had just finished making a new kite from bamboo paper and thin silk, and it lay in the sun firming up. So now the kite is actually, you can see it. I was able to get a picture that actually is almost the same kind of kite that is being described here. So it's a new kite and it's made from bamboo paper and thin silk, and it lay in the sun firming up. And it was a pale pink kite with a small green tail. So look at the kind of details that have gone into describing the kite. The old man handed it to Ali, and the boy raised himself on his toes and kissed his grandfather's hollowed out cheek. The boy is so grateful because he was very upset that he had lost his kite, but now the grandfather is so kind that he has given him another one, in fact, a more beautiful one. And he's so happy that he raises himself on his toes and kisses his grandfather's cheek. And look at the description, the hollowed out cheek. So here is another expression, a few more words, a few more adjectives to describe the appearance of the old man. And the boy is very happy, and he assures his grandfather that he will not lose this one. He says, I will not lose this one, he said. This kite will fly like a bird. And he turned on his heels and skipped out of the courtyard. So it's a very brief scene, but what do we have here, students? We have the introduction of the tree, the old tree. In fact, he uses the word, Bond uses the word an ancient banyan tree, and it has grown through the cracks of an abandoned mosque. The tree is old, the mosque is abandoned, and the narrow street, the cobblestones, it's an old-fashioned street, and so it's made up of cobblestones. And here's this old man who's poor, and the boy Ali is also poor. And how do we know this? We know this because the boy is described as barefoot and clad only in a torn shirt. And so we see quickly, let us have a brief recap. The boy runs along the cobblestones, and he comes to where his grandfather sits nodding dreamily and wakes him up by shouting and telling him that his kite has gone. So the old man wakes up and he assumes that the twine is broken, but then the boy is quick to tell him that it's not the twine that is broken, but the kite is stuck in the banyan tree. And the old man finds this funny, and he tells the boy that there's so much love in the way he addresses his child. And he says, you have yet to learn how to fly a kite properly, my child, he says. And so he tells the child that it's okay, let him not worry, because he has another kite for him. And he gives him a beautiful new kite, which is pale pink in color, and which has a small green tail. And the boy is so happy that he raises himself on his toes and kisses his grandfather's cheek. And he tells him, very definitely that he's not going to lose this one. Of course, the reader knows that he may lose it because, after all, kites will not stay forever. And since the boy is very young, he's sure to lose it. But even then, we go along with the old man and listen to him very indulgently. And the boy turns on his heels and skips out of the courtyard. So with this, let us move on, students. The old man remained dreaming in the sun. His kite shop was gone, the premises long since sold to a junk dealer, but he still made kites for his own amusement and for the benefit of his grandson Ali. Not many people bought kites these days. Adults disdained them, and children preferred to spend their money at the cinema. Moreover, there were not many open spaces left for the flying of kites. The city had swallowed up the open grassland that had stretched from the old fort's walls to the river bank. But the old man remembered a time when grown men flew kites and great battles were fought, the kites swerving and swooping in the sky, tangling with each other until the string of one was severed. Then the defeated but liberated kite would float away into the blue unknown. There was a good deal of betting, and money frequently changed hands. Kite flying was then the sport of kings, and the old man remembered how the Nawab himself would come down to the riverside with his retinue to participate in this noble pastime. There was time then to spend an idle hour with a gay dancing strip of paper. Now everyone hurried in a heat of hope, and delicate things like kites and daydreams were trampled underfoot. He, Mahmud the kite maker, had in the prime of his life been well known throughout the city. Some of his more elaborate kites once sold for as much as 3 or 4 rupees each. So let us go back, students, to 2 slides. And yes, once the young boy leaves, once Ali leaves, the old man remained dreaming in the sun. So as we have already seen, he was nodding dreamily in the old courtyard, and the boy comes and wakes him up. But then now he goes back to his daydreams. And what does he dream about? Let us see. His kite shop was gone, the premises long since sold to a junk dealer. But he still made kites for his own amusement and for the benefit of his grandson Ali. So the old man had a beautiful shop. I mean, he had a shop which was full of his beautiful kites at one time, but now he no longer has it. The kite shop was gone. The premises long since sold to a junk dealer. Very sadly, the shop which had been filled with beautiful kites was sold to a junk dealer. But even then, the old man has not given up making kites. But now he makes kites, but these are only for his own amusement and for the benefit of his grandson Ali. So why is that so? As the narrator says, not many people bought kites these days. This line is very important because it shows how earlier, in a time much earlier than the time in which the story is set, people used to buy kites, but now not many people bought kites these days. Adults disdained them, they rejected them, and children preferred to spend their money at the cinema. The children are no longer interested in flying kites. Instead, they prefer to go to the cinema and watch movies. Moreover, there were not many open spaces left for the flying of kites. So the narrator says that not many people bought kites these days. This is one reason why he's no longer making kites for others. And adults disdain them. Adults are no longer interested in flying kites. And similarly, children are also not interested because they would rather go to the cinema and spend their money there. And in addition to all this, there were not many open spaces left for the flying of kites. So you see how students, the movement in the story moves outward, and we can see how the landscape is also affected. And there are not many open spaces left for the flying of kites. And why is that so? It is so because the city had swallowed up the open grassland that had stretched from the old fort's walls to the river bank. So there was this huge and open grassland that used to stretch between the old fort's walls and the river bank. But this has now been encroached upon, and the city has extended to, and it has taken up all this land, so that there is no more any open space left for the flying of kites. So this paragraph tells us what has happened and why the kite maker is no longer making kites for sale. So you can see, students, how the city has enlarged, and it has taken up all the open spaces, and adults are not interested in flying kites, and children also no longer show any interest in such a pastime, and they would rather go to the cinema and watch movies. And then next, but the old man remembered a time, and now the story moves into the past, because now the old man remembers a time when grown men flew kites and great battles were fought. So as you can see, there are so many kites in the air, and grown men used to fly kites, and they used to fight great battles. And what about the kites? The kites were swerving and swooping in the sky as though they were alive, and tangling with each other until the string of one was severed. So they would, swerve and swoop in the sky. They would keep moving, and they would keep tangling with each other until ultimately one of the kites would get, cut and severed. And then what would happen? Then the defeated but liberated kite would float away into the blue unknown. So look at the way the kite is almost like a human being, as almost like a living thing. And the kite is defeated, but even in its defeat, it actually savors the flavor of liberty, of freedom. And so the kite is free to float away into the blue unknown. And the very description actually kind of envies the kite for its freedom. So even though the kite has been defeated, it has still won freedom. It is no longer tied to the human being at the end of the string, and now the kite is free to fly in the air. And the idea behind this is that the kite is now free, and it has more liberty than the human beings on the ground. And then the narrator goes on to say that there was a good deal of betting, and money frequently changed hands. The point here is that there was a time when uh, kite flying was not just the pastime of children, it was actually the pastime of grown men too. And not only was it something entertaining, but it also made money, because there was a good deal of betting. People used to fight, people used to have great battles, and they also used to, bet on the outcome of these battles. And money frequently changed hands, he says. Kite flying was then the sport of kings. So look at the way the importance increases. In the previous paragraph, we have seen how kite flying was once, the favorite pastime of many people and of adults, and how they used to make money out of it by betting. And now it has escalated, and you see how kite flying was also the sport of kings. And the old man remembered how the Nawab himself would come down to the riverside with his retinue to participate in this noble pastime. So the Nawab, who is the most richest person in that area, and who is the richest person, and who is the most powerful over there. And the Nawab himself would actually come down to the riverside with all his people, with all his people accompanying him, and he would also participate in this pastime. And now the narrator uses the word noble pastime. So it's not just something for entertainment. Now it has become noble, because as the narrator tells us, kite flying was then the sport of kings. And therefore, this pastime, which nobody has any time for in the present, was actually a noble pastime in the past. And there was time then, the narrator says, to spend an idle hour with a gay dancing strip of paper. So in those days, there was enough time for people to spend an hour in leisure with a gay dancing strip of paper. Now, everyone hurried in a heat of hope, and delicate things like kites and daydreams were trampled underfoot. And now nobody had enough time or energy to pay any kind of attention to delicate things like kites and daydreams. Nobody had the time to sit and daydream. Nobody had the time to fly kites. And so such delicate things like kites and daydreams were all trampled or trodden by the clumsy feet of people. So nobody were actually bothered. Nobody was bothered about these wonderful things that are kites and daydreams. And now you have the name of the kite maker. He, Mahmud the kite maker, had in the prime of his life been well known throughout the city. Some of his more elaborate kites once sold for as much as um, yeah, as much as 3 or 4 rupees each, says the narrator. It is now that you actually get to see the name of the kite maker. You get to know the name of the kite maker. And what is his name, students? His name is Mahmud. So he, Mahmud the kite maker, had in the prime of his life been well known throughout the city. Some of his more elaborate kites once sold for as much as 3 or 4 rupees each. So in those days, 3 or 4 rupees was actually, it was actually a fortune. And so Mahmud the kite maker was very, very popular in those days. And what were those days? Those were the days when adults used to play the game, and they used to bet on it, and it was also the sport of kings. So in those days, Mahmud the kite maker had been a very, very popular person, and his art of making kites was spoken about far and wide. And now look at this. At the request of the Nawab, he had once made a very special kind of kite, unlike any that had been seen in the district. It consisted of a series of small, very light paper discs trailing on a thin bamboo frame. To the end of each disc, he fixed a sprig of grass, forming a balance on both sides. The surface of the foremost disc was slightly convex, and a fantastic face was painted on it, having 2 eyes made of small mirrors. The disc, decreasing in size from head to tail, assumed an undulatory form and gave the kite the appearance of a crawling serpent. It required great skill to raise this cumbersome device from the ground, and only Mahmud could manage it. Everyone had heard of the Dragon Kite that Mahmud had built, and word went round that it possessed supernatural powers. A large crowd assembled in the open to watch its first public launching in the presence of the Nawab. At the first attempt, it refused to leave the ground. The disc made a plaintive protesting sound, and the sun was trapped in the little mirrors, making of the kite a living, complaining creature. Before we read about what happened to the Dragon Kite, let us quickly go back because I want you to make note of certain things here, students. At the request of the Nawab, he had once made a very special kind of kite, unlike any that had been seen in the district. So there are 2 things here in this sentence. It's a long sentence, and there are 2 important things here, students. At the request of the Nawab. So you can see how the Nawab could actually request the kite maker to make a special kind of kite. So this sentence shows how very important, or how much importance was given to the kite maker. So the Nawab requests him to make a very special kind of kite. And this kite should be unlike any that had been seen in the district. So this was a special kite, a very special kite. And what was it like? It consisted of a series of small, very light paper discs trailing on a thin bamboo frame. And to the end of each disc, he fixed a sprig of grass, forming a balance on both sides. So look at how carefully and how well made, how carefully he crafts the kite actually. And he's very, very, the details are very intricate. As you can see, the surface of the foremost disc was slightly convex, and a fantastic face was painted on it, having 2 eyes made of small mirrors. And the discs, which are decreasing in size from head to tail, they have a form which looks like the form of a serpent. And so the very appearance of the kite is very striking. And not just that, but it also required great skill to raise it, because it was a cumbersome device. It was very heavy to handle, and only Mahmud could manage it. And the fame of this, the reputation of this particular kite was all over. It was spread from word to word, from mouth to mouth, and everybody came to know about it. So everyone had heard of the Dragon Kite, and look at the way they have already given it a title, and the kite is now called Dragon Kite, and everybody knew that Mahmud had built it, and the word went around that the kite possessed supernatural powers. Not only was it striking to look at, it was also supposed to actually possess supernatural powers. Of course, this was just a rumor, but then it increased people's interest, and everybody assembled in the open when it was supposed to be launched in the presence of the Nawab. At the first attempt, it refused to leave the ground. So it's almost as though the kite is personified, because the narrator says that at the first attempt, the kite refused to leave the ground. It was not ready to leave the ground. The disc made a plaintive, protesting sound, and the sun was trapped in the little mirrors, making of the kite a living, complaining creature. So, as mentioned earlier, Mahmud had actually stuck two glass mirrors in the place of its, as though it was stuck as though to replicate eyes, and the sun was trapped in the little mirrors, and this looked as though the kite began to look as though it was a living creature. And not just that, that the sound that it was making made it seem like a living, complaining creature. Moving on. Then the wind came from the right direction, and the dragon kite soared into the sky, wriggling its way higher and higher, the sun still glinting in its devil eyes. And when it went very high, it pulled fiercely on the twine, and Mahmud's young sons had to help him with the reel. Still the kite pulled, determined to be free, to break loose, to live a life of its own, and eventually it did so. The twine snapped, the kite leaped away toward the sun, sailing on heavenward until it was lost to view. It was never found again, and Mahmud wondered afterwards if he had made it too vivid, too living a thing of the great kite. He did not make another like it. Instead, he presented to the Nawab a musical kite, one that made a sound like a violin when it rose in the air. And so what happened then? As we have already seen, students, many people had come to the open place where the kite was supposed to be launched in the presence of the Nawab, since they had heard so much about it. And for quite some time, the kite was not ready to fly into the air. The wind was not in the right direction. But then the wind came from the right direction, says the narrator, and the dragon kite soared into the sky. And as it was up in the sky, it began to wriggle its way higher and higher. And since it had devil's eyes, look at the way the narrator calls those pieces of glass devil's eyes, because the sun was glinting, was shining in its devil's eyes. And when it went very high, the kite began to pull on the twine, and Mahmud was not able to handle it all alone. So his young sons went to help him with the reel. Still the kite pulled, determined to be free, to break loose, and it as though it wanted to live a life of its own. And eventually, it managed to break free. The twine snapped, and the kite leaped away towards the sun, sailing on heavenward until it was lost to view, until nobody was able to see it again. But what happened then? Mahmud never made another one like it. Instead, he presented to the Nawab a musical kite, he says. And this musical kite made a sound like a violin when it rose in the air. And sometimes Mahmud wondered whether he made the kite in a manner which was too vivid and which made it seem like a living creature. So he wondered whether he should not have done it or created it like that. But then somehow he never ever does another one like it. And so you can see how the kites that he has already created in the description we have just seen are unique. Nobody else was able to make kites like Mahmud. If one kite was like a dragon and it had so much life in it, Another kite it was a musical kite which could make the sound of a violin as it rose into the air. And then the narrator goes on to say that those were more leisurely, more spacious days. But the Nawab had died years ago, and his descendants were almost as poor as Mahmud himself. Kite makers, like poets, once had their patrons, but no one knew Mahmud simply because there were too many people in the gully and they could not be bothered with their neighbors. When Mahmud was younger and had fallen sick, everyone in the neighborhood had come to ask after his health. But now, when his days were drawing to a close, no one visited him. Most of his old friends were dead, and his sons had grown up. One was working in a local garage, and the other, who was in Pakistan at the time of the partition, had not been able to rejoin his relatives. The children who had bought kites from him 10 years ago were now grown men struggling for a living. They did not have time for the old man and his memories. They had grown up in a swiftly changing and competitive world, and they looked at the old kite maker and the banyan tree with the same indifference. Both were taken for granted, permanent fixtures that were of no concern to the raucous, sweating mass of humanity that surrounded them. No longer did people gather under the banyan tree to discuss their problems and their plans. Only in the summer months did a few seek shelter from the fierce sun. But there was the boy, his grandson. It was good that Mahmud's son worked close by, for it gladdened the old man's heart to watch the small boy at play in the winter sunshine, growing under his eyes like a young and well-nourished sapling, putting forth new leaves every day. There is a great affinity between trees and men. We grow at much the same pace if we are not hurt or starved or cut down. In our youth, we are resplendent creatures, and in our declining years, we stoop a little, we remember, we stretch our brittle limbs in the sun, and then with a sigh, we shed our last leaves. Let us go back. After the description of the kite, which managed to escape, there is a description of the kind of days that are no longer here now, and the story tells us that the Nawab had died years ago, and his descendants or successors were almost as poor as Mahmud. So they don't have the money or the wealth to extend their patronage to artists or craftsmen like Mahmud. In the olden days, when the days were more leisurely and more spacious, the Nawab, or people like the Nawab, could actually extend some of their patronage. They could patronize arts and crafts, and people like Mahmud and others were able to survive. But now that the Nawab has died and his descendants were also poor, Mahmud had nobody to patronize him. And so kite makers like poets once had their patrons, says the narrator, but now no one knew Mahmud because now there are so many people in the gully that nobody even bothered about him. So when Mahmud was younger and had fallen sick, everybody in the neighborhood used to come and ask after his health. But now when he's an old man and he's almost close to his death, no one comes to visit him. Almost all of his friends are dead now, and his sons have grown up. One of his sons is actually working in a local garage, and the other, who is in Pakistan when he was in Pakistan during the time of the partition, was not able to come to India ever again, and so he has only one son with him. The children who had bought kites from him 10 years ago were all now grown men, and they were all struggling for their own living, so they had no time for the old man or his memories. And what kind of a world were they living in? They had grown up in a swiftly changing and competitive world. And so for them, the kite maker or the banyan tree have no importance at all. And so they look at them with the same indifference. So both, that is the kite maker and the banyan tree, were taken for granted. So they aren't like permanent fixtures which have absolutely no importance at all and no value at all for all the human beings that are moving around them. No longer did people gather under the banyan tree to discuss their problems and their plans. There was a time when people used to come and sit under the banyan tree and they would discuss and they would talk about their lives and their plans and in general have a very good time. But now it is only in the summer months that a very few people come to the banyan tree to seek shelter from the fierce sun. It is no longer a meeting place for human beings, for people in the village, and so the banyan tree is completely ignored by the people around it. Similarly, the old man, Mahmud, is also ignored by people around him. Nobody even cares for the old man. Nobody cares for the banyan tree. But there is one saving grace, and that is the fact that there is this boy, his grandson, Ali. So it was good that Mahmud's son worked close by. And this is because it is good because Mahmud has a chance to actually watch the small boy at play. And every day, as he watches the child, he notices how the boy is growing like a young and well-nourished sapling. And just as this sapling puts forth new leaves each day, the boy is growing and flourishing under his eyes. So the narrator says a very, very important thing here. He says that there is a great affinity between trees and men. And what is this affinity? And why is there an affinity according to him? We grow at the same pace. The tree and human beings, or trees and human beings, grow at the same pace. So if nobody else interferes, if we are not hurt or starved or cut down, then we grow at very much the same pace, he says. In our youth, we are resplendent creatures, we are brilliant, we are dazzling creatures. And in our declining years, as we grow old, we stoop a little. We remember, we stretch our brittle limbs in the sun, and then with a sigh, we shed our last leaves. So just like the trees bend as they grow older, human beings also stoop a little and their limbs become brittle. And then at last, with a sigh, we shed our last leaves. So I want you to pay attention to this, students. This with a sigh, we shed our last leaves. We'll come to this at the end of the lesson. So there is this beautiful comparison between trees and men. And Ruskin Bond is trying to tell us that just like trees, human beings also, go through a phase when they, in fact, flourish in their youth and then decline as they grow older. And at last, when they are very old, they just sigh and shed their last leaves, and it means that they die. So this comparison is very important, students. We'll come back to this in our next lesson. Mahmud was like the banyan, his hands gnarled and twisted like the roots of the ancient tree. Ali was like the young mimosa planted at the end of the courtyard. In 2 years, both he and the tree would acquire the strength and confidence of their early youth. So Mahmud, the old man, the old kite maker, is compared to the banyan tree, to the old banyan tree, the ancient banyan tree. And his hands are gnarled and twisted like the roots of the ancient tree. So the description is very apt. So Mahmud and the banyan tree resemble each other so much that they're almost the one and the same. And now there is a new comparison, and Ali, the grandson, the little boy, is compared to the young mimosa which is planted at the end of the courtyard. So the mimosa is otherwise known as the touch me not, and it has very sensitive leaves. So if someone touches it, the leaves just come close together. So the comparison is to show us, to tell the readers how Ali is a very sensitive and very young and very tender and innocent child. And so Ali is compared to the mimosa plant. And in 2 years, says the narrator, both he and the tree would acquire the strength and confidence of the early youth. So in youth, people are young and strong and confident. But as they grow older, all this is lost. They lose their youth, they lose their strength, and they lose their confidence. So this is the comparison, students. So I hope you have actually paid attention to it. And now let us move on to the end of the lesson. The voices in the street grew fainter, and Mahmud wondered if he was going to fall asleep and dream, as he so often did, of a beautiful, powerful kite resembling the great white bird of the Hindus, the Garuda, God Vishnu's famous steed. He would like to make a wonderful new kite for little Ali. He had nothing else to leave the boy. He heard Ali's voice in the distance, but did not realize that the boy was calling out to him. The voice seemed to come from very far away. Ali was at the courtyard door asking if his mother had as yet returned from the bazaar. When Mahmud did not answer, the boy came forward repeating his question. The sunlight was slanting across the old man's head, and a small white butterfly was perched on his flowing beard. Mahmud was silent, and when Ali put his small brown hand on the old man's shoulder, he got no response. The boy heard a faint sound like the rubbing of marbles in his pocket. Suddenly afraid, Ali turned and moved to the door and then ran down the street shouting for his mother. And in the banyan tree, a sudden gust of wind caught the torn kite and lifted it into the air, carrying it far above the struggling, sweating city into the blue sky. So, pay attention, students. Let us see what happens here. The voices in the street grew fainter, and Mahmud wondered if he was going to fall asleep and dream, as he so often did. So Mahmud was recollecting his past. So as we can see, the story begins with him daydreaming, and he's actually sitting in the open courtyard and daydreaming and remembering things from the past. And then the boy comes and disturbs his reverie and tells him that he has lost the kite. So Mahmud gives him a new kite and then goes back to his dreaming. And he moves into the past and he remembers what things were like in the olden days. And he remembers the days when his craft was spoken about far and wide, and when he also would have the Nawab requesting him to make special kites. But then what happened was that things changed, and people stopped buying kites and they stopped flying kites, and the Nawab was no longer alive and his successors were no longer rich, and so they couldn't sponsor or patronize Mahmud. And so Mahmud is now a poor man, and he is a man who is ignored by everybody. All his name and fame are no longer remembered by others. And as he lays there and as he keeps thinking about the past, the voices in the street grew fainter. And Mahmud begins to wonder whether he's going to go back to his sleep because he used to do this very often. And so he thinks that maybe he's going to dream once again of a beautiful, powerful kite resembling the great white bird of the Hindus, the Garuda. And he's fascinated by this bird, and so he thinks that maybe he's going to dream of it. And he wants to make a wonderful new kite for little Ali. As he tells himself, he has nothing else to leave the boy. He doesn't have any money or any property that he can leave the child. And so all he wants to do is maybe make a wonderful new kite for Ali and give it to the boy. And he hears the boy's voice in the distance. He does not realize that actually the boy is very close to him. It's as though the boy is at a very far distance, and that the boy is very far, somewhere in the distance. And gradually he stops hearing the voice. So now the story is told from the perspective of the young boy. So Ali was at the courtyard door asking if his mother had as yet returned from the bazaar. Mahmud did not answer, and so the boy comes close to him and he repeats his question. Then the sunlight, which was slanting across the old man's head, it shows a small white butterfly was perched on his flowing beard. And Mahmud was silent, and the boy comes close to him and he puts his hand on the old man's shoulder. And when he still doesn't get a response, the boy is worried. And the boy hears a faint sound like the rubbing of marbles in his pocket. It is this sound which is very important, students, because if you remember, the narrator had spoken about the sigh with which trees and men die. And the tree dies with a sigh and all the leaves fall down. So this is the moment when Ali is actually dying. And Mahmud is actually dying. And the boy Ali hears the sound, but he doesn't know what it means. Even so, his instincts are all, roused, and he's suddenly scared. He's afraid. And so he turns and moves to the door and runs down the street shouting for his mother. And then in the banyan tree, a sudden gust of wind caught the torn kite and lifted it into the air, carrying it far above the struggling, sweating city into the blue sky. And so the kite, which was until then stuck in the banyan tree, suddenly it becomes free when a sudden gust of wind comes, and the torn kite is taken up in the air, and the wind takes the torn kite, and carries it far above the struggling, sweating city into the blue sky. So what does this mean? This last paragraph is very important, students. It means that the old man Mahmud is dead, and his soul, in the form of the kite, has been taken away by the wind, the strong gust of wind, and now it goes up into the air, and it, like the dragon kite, which had once, gained liberty and which had flown up into the sky. This kite, the torn kite, actually becomes free, and it flies up into the blue sky, leaving behind the struggling, sweating city. So the story ends with the death of Mahmud, and it also ends with the death of an era. The story is actually about the passing of an era, about the inevitability of change, how things change and how people have to accept change. So I hope you like the story, students, but before we end the lesson, let us just take a quick look at the points, important points in the lesson. The Kitemaker by Ruskin Bond is a poignant story of the old kitemaker Mahmud, and through him, the passing of an era. It describes the simple and easy life of bygone days when arts and crafts were honored and people had both time and leisure to enjoy them. Kite flying was once the hobby of the Nawabs and had great prestige, but now people had lost their interest in it. They did not care for the pastime or for the old kite maker. The narrator compares the old kite maker to the banyan tree in order to emphasize that both are old and fixed in life, and also that they have outlived their usefulness. Both cannot move from the boundary within which they grew, and thus cannot find their significance in the modern competitive world. The story highlights the fact that the landscape has changed just as people have changed. Moving with the sweating mass of humanity, the city has lost all grace and no longer has any open fields left for flying kites. The indifferent attitude of Mahmud's neighbors shows the depths to which both culture and humanity have reached. The death of the kite maker signifies the death of the values and the lifestyle of days gone by. Finally, it can be said that the story discusses themes like the conflict between tradition and modernity, the loss of a whole way of life, and the inevitability of change. So that's all for today, students. In the next class, we will be discussing how to analyze a short story, and the same story will be taken up to analyze its elements. So until then, dear students, goodbye and thank you.